I'm Emily Morehouse. I am the Director of Engineering at a company called Cuttlesoft. We are a digital product development company. We make anything from web and mobile applications to CI/CD pipelines, cloud architectures, embedded systems, and kind of anything in between. I am a Python core developer, which you may have guessed is one of the reasons why I'm here today. I'm also the chair of PyCon for 2020 and 2021. And I consider myself to be a polyglot. I work a lot with Python, but I also work a lot with JavaScript and a few other different languages on a daily basis. I'm a huge proponent of visual testing. I really enjoy screenshot testing. If you're interested in that, come find me after. And I really like auto formatting. And in general, I'm just a really, really huge language nerd. I also like things like playing video games, doing yoga, and I have a really cute dog. So this is a picture of my dog Suki from a couple days before I left Denver to come here. She has a minor paw injury, so she has to wear this silly cone until she's all healed up. And so now that I've distracted you with this simultaneously sad and cute picture, we're going to start things off today by talking about the House of Wisdom. The House of Wisdom was also known as the Grand Library of Baghdad. It was an intellectual powerhouse of knowledge and culture that started in the 700s AD. Scholars of all kinds would gather here to document and translate their shared knowledge, from alchemists and engineers to historians and architects. It sat as the centerpiece of Muslim culture in Baghdad's heyday over 1,300 years ago. There was a desire that grew out of this concentration of scholars to share knowledge as widely as possible. It created a translation movement that lasted over 2 centuries. Greek texts were translated into Arabic to be more widely understood by their people. They translated Pythagoras, Plato, Aristotle, and Euclid, among many others. The availability of this new knowledge propelled scholars towards new studies and discoveries in medicine, agriculture, finance, and engineering. A mathematician named Muhammad al-Khwarizmi worked in the House of Knowledge, where he contributed to the development of algebra. The application of the word algebra was actually first applied to mathematics at this time, and the etymology of the word algorithm can actually be traced back to the Latin derivation of his name. These physical texts that were created remained sacred. Copies of these translated manuscripts took so much time to create that they had to really put the value on physical texts that they had in person. These had to be copied word by word and letter by letter. On February 13th, 1258, over 500 years later, Hulagu Khan led the Mongols into the city, starting a full week of pillage and destruction. The Mongols laid waste to the city and left nearly nothing in their wake. Half a millennia of acquired knowledge was wiped out in a matter of days. It is estimated that 100,000 people were killed by the Mongols' hands, and the Tigris River ran dark with the combination of ink and blood as a result of the carnage. Ink of words that no one would ever read again. Now, I'm not here to talk to you about the Islamic Golden Age or lost manuscripts. We don't have or use manuscripts today. Everything is digitized. We have digital documents with cloud backups that we can share and persist across the internet for the future of our internet and Earth and universe as we know it. We no longer have to be at risk at losing information that has been written down. But what are we writing down? Our lives as developers are driven by documentation and well-commented code. We roll our eyes when documented behavior doesn't match actual behavior, and we mentally slam our fists on our desks when a documentation site goes down for a few minutes, or proper installation of a package isn't easily found in a README. In 2015, I first heard the term Python core developer. If you had asked me then what a core developer was, I would have said someone who helps maintain the libraries and language of Python. It was at PyCon 2015 in Montreal when I first heard this term. The year before, I had started grad school, where I was studying programming languages and compilers. Like most of us, I didn't know what my next step was or where my path was going to lead me. Was I going to stay in academia? Would I wind up taking a job offer and moving away from Florida? I wound up doing none of those things. I actually wound up dropping out of grad school and took the leap to start a software company with my now husband. So back to PyCon. Having the financial security for a fresh-faced company to send both Frank and I to this alluringly Parisian city at the largest Python conference in the world was something that was deeply validating. It was a hint to me that something, somewhere along the lines, was going in the right direction, despite the feeling that I was really leaving something behind that I really loved. I loved programming languages and had been doing some really cool research on compilers and parsers. So I was sort of unhappy that I was leaving that behind because I didn't see a way that building a compiler or parser or a new language fit into building a company like Cuttlesoft. So at PyCon Montreal 2015, Guido van Rossum, our beloved creator of Python, made an announcement during his keynote. He had made an observation that at the time, there were 0 female core developers. And so it was his goal that by the next year's PyCon that they had at least 2 female core developers. Frank leaned over and whispered to me, it's like, you could totally do that. Like, that's right up your alley. That's everything that you thought that you were leaving behind. Like, how cool would it be for you to be able to contribute to Python and sort of find that love in a very new way? I still didn't really know what a core developer was, but the idea of getting to help build and support a language that I loved felt like a really gratifying way to connect back to the life of programming languages that I had just left behind. So as luck would have it, I did have a chance to meet Guido. We wound up at the same sort of post-conference event, and Frank and another conference attendee kind of encouraged me to get up and go talk to him and introduce myself. And so I kind of stumbled up there and I was like, I heard your announcement and I really like Python and I like compilers and how can I help? And so very, very shortly into that conversation, our new conference attendee friend walked by and took a like paparazzi style flash photo of me talking to Guido. And I just sort of like immediately turned bright red and like was like, abort, abort, abort. And so Guido kind of moved on graciously and said, you know, here's my email, send me an email and we can get started kind of thing, and just kind of moved on from it. But I like scurried back to my table and just like started burrowing directly into the ground. There was absolutely no way that like me at that point in time was actually going to follow up and email him at that point. I was far too embarrassed. So PyCon 2016 came and went, and there were still no female core developers. In response, Guido actually offered to personally mentor anyone who was interested in stepping up. At that point, I was kind of kicking myself. I was like, come on, like I have to do this. I can't let this like silly interaction affect the things that I want to do. So I emailed him and made a joke about how he probably remembered me from the embarrassing photo incident. In a very Guido way, he moved on graciously and invited me to start mentorship meetings with him every few weeks. Now, I had never been officially mentored before, and I really didn't know what to expect. I suppose I went in kind of expecting Guido to say, you know, here's this bug. I think that this is a really great bug for you to go fix. Go work on this and come back with your patch, and we'll review it, and I can help you along the way. But he didn't do that at all. He really left the door completely open for me to guide what I wanted to learn and do. So new contributors are pointed to the Python Dev Guide, which is a really, really excellent resource. It's a really good documentation on the Python lifecycle and workflows. We're also pointed to the bug tracker and told to work on fixing bugs or documentation typos to learn the process of contributing. Now, this isn't often a very fruitful process. Bugs that can be easily fixed are often patched in record time, and the ones remaining have these really, really long histories of like hundreds of comments with no real direction on how to actually solve the problem at hand. It's not really a great place for someone to come in and start and feel any sort of validation because you can't come in and make an impact very quickly. So I tried to take this experience and learn from it. So if I wound up starting on a bug fix that somebody else sort of beat me to a solution for, I would try to still complete my implementation and then go back and compare and contrast against the patch that was submitted by typically another core developer. This allowed me to see different things about the CPython environment that I wouldn't have necessarily known otherwise. Whether it was a helper function that I could have used, a different way of doing things, different impacts that changing one area of the code might have on another, different edge cases that maybe I just wasn't thinking about because I was too myopic in my views of the code base. So I tried to take that and turn it into a positive experience. But at the end of the day, I still felt like I wasn't really contributing anything. And so since that didn't seem to get me anywhere fast, I decided to go back to my roots and the things that interested me. I actually started reading the source code and stepping through the compiler and parser and interpreter to figure out how all of these CPython internals worked under the hood. So I just went through and put a bunch of print statements or opened up a debugger and let it step through the code so I could see what it was actually doing. Guido warned me at this time that these parts of the code don't really change very much. There weren't really any bugs in the compiler that needed to be fixed. And I realized that what I had actually been looking at were 15-plus-year-old files that hadn't been touched in basically as many years. And I thought, well, okay, this is fine. I'm enjoying what I'm doing. I feel like I'm learning a lot. So I kind of opted to just keep going. And not knowing what I was reading turned into a process of learning and discovering. But it really came in waves. A lot of times I felt like I was doing something really, really cool and learning a lot. And then on the other hand, I would feel like I wasn't really doing anything at all. And so I would get really introspective and doubtful of any sort of lack of progress that you could actually put on paper. And so I hadn't taken the path that I was told to take. I wondered, had I made the wrong decision? Had I done something wrong? Was I maybe just not cut out for this type of work? Maybe I should have started with documentation typos and bug fixes, but maybe I was just trying to do too much as a new contributor. And so I struggled, and if I hadn't had the support of a mentor at this point, I probably would have walked away from Python development. So, on September 12th, 1940, barely a year after the beginning of World War II, an 18-year-old mechanic named Marcel Ravidad was walking with his dog, Robot, when Robot fell down into a hole. Ravidad and his two friends followed the hole and discovered a 49-foot deep shaft and rediscovered a place called the Lecaux Cave. The walls and ceilings of the cave were covered in hundreds of paintings from long-lost ancestors, consisting mostly of depictions of animals, but also childhood art project-style outlines of hands, many of which were missing pieces of fingers that had been amputated due to frostbite. It is said that when Picasso visited the cave, he looked at the paintings and said, "We have created nothing." Our modern minds may warp our interpretations of the work, but the fact that it was so important to document these ideas and depictions of life says a lot about the priorities of our ancient hunter-gatherer ancestors, whose primary goals in life were merely to have enough food and water to survive. But the cave that was visited by over 1,200 people daily after it was opened to the public started deteriorating. Mold, lichens, and crystals started to form in the cave, and the mere presence of a human being breathing was making it all the worse. As John Green said in his podcast, The Anthropocene Reviewed, just the act of looking at something can ruin it. A replica of the cave has been created so that humans can still view a sort of shell of the original work without continuing to destroy it. But it's ironic that to protect something, we must keep people so far away that they can't experience it at all. There's so much history and so many stories that aren't told by looking at the code of a project, especially with a code base as old as CPython, that doesn't get communicated or archived. Some of my favorite moments in my process were when I would come across something in my sort of meandering discoveries that was particularly confusing to me. I'd get a chance to ask Guido about it, and he would say, "Oh, now that's interesting." And I would find these really innocuous pieces of the code that turned out to have really interesting backstories as to why things came to be the way they were. We have relics, much like our cave paintings, but context is lost, and collective knowledge changes over time. I would never have learned these things if I hadn't sort of stumbled across them and asked about it. Having a respect for the history of a project is really important. With CPython, it would be really great to come in and just rip a bunch of things out and do it better and in a more modern way, but it would completely disregard the history of why things came to be the way they are. So where does our history live? Has it been adequately tallied and noted? Or does it live in these temporal memories of people who may not always be with us? My process went on for a long time, like over a year and a half or so. And so I worried that during one of my meetings with Guido, he would say, okay, this has gone on long enough. I need my time back. But he didn't, and he never gave me any sort of reason to doubt myself or to doubt the support and mentorship that he was giving me. It was all in my head. At PyCon 2017, I was invited to attend the Language Summit. I didn't do much more than listen and soak it all in. I sort of like crept in the back and then snuck out without really talking to anyone. If you haven't guessed it yet, I'm a little bit of an introvert. And by May of 2017, we had our first 2 female core developers, and Guido's goal was met. Skipping ahead a year, I decided to try to make more of an effort to participate. I started reading the Python dev mailing lists and started interacting with other core developers in different ways. And so around that time, 2 really big things happened. Around PyCon 2018, a controversial debate was settled, and a monumental change was coming to Python. Changes are made to Python through a mechanism called Python Enhancement Proposals, or PEPs. PEPs can be drafted by any member of the community and then are reviewed to see if they should be incorporated into the language. PEP 572 proved to be one of the most controversial PEPs in Python's history. It introduced a new syntax to the language called assignment expressions, now lovingly referred to as the walrus operator. So just after PyCon 2018, Guido declared that PEP 572 had been accepted. But this process had taken a great toll. One after the other, PEP 572 was accepted, and Guido stepped down as BDFL. Through this series of really unfortunate events, something sort of lucky happened for me. Guido asked me if I was interested in implementing assignment expressions. This was the moment that everything really came together. Everything that I had worked on and that I had learned over the course of the last few years had really fallen into place and poised me as the person who was really best suited to have to dive into all this older code and add a new syntax to the language. He told me, I know it's going to be really tricky. When they were actually writing the PEP, they talked about different ways where they were like, we don't actually know how this is going to work in practice, but we'll figure it out. And these were some of my favorite moments. So we had these whiteboard conference tables in one of our office conference rooms, and I would go in there and I would just cover the whole thing with notes and design information and questions and all these things that I wanted to learn and figure out as I was going through it. And so over the next couple of months, I had actually gotten about 90% of the PEP implemented. And I was graciously invited to attend the core developer sprint in September of 2018. And I was able to work with Guido in person and finalize all these sort of rough edges of the implementation. And it was then that I became an official core developer. From the outside looking in, there's no way to know how much time went into my journey. There isn't a commit log of my successes or breakthroughs in understanding or my doubts and the many times where I felt like I wasn't cut out for core development. My path didn't wind up being the one that I expected, and I imagine it feels that way for a lot of other people. I had to give myself time and space for things to happen as they needed and not how I wanted them to happen. I also had to put myself out there and try to gain their trust. And at the end of the day, the pinnacle of being a core developer is trust. We have to trust that people will uphold the CPython name, that they will be good community members and kind to other people. They won't merge in PRs haphazardly, and that they'll take care in the code that they're crafting. It's something that you just can't really measure in the number of commits that somebody has to a repository. And so I dealt with a term that a lot of us are probably very comfortable saying, but don't necessarily fully internalize the meaning or feelings of it sometimes. I think we all experience imposter syndrome at some level, and it can be crippling. I have a couple of tweets that I think really embody this. So this spoke to me. This says, imposter syndrome will have you questioning your place in the spaces that you prayed about being in. This spoke to me because you can put in so much work to get somewhere that you really, really want to be, and yet, even once you get there, you can have this little demon in the back of your head telling you that you don't actually deserve to be there. Reframing imposter syndrome a bit in terms of how our communities impact our personal feelings is interesting. We're lucky that Python has a far more inclusive environment for underrepresented groups than other areas of technology, but we sometimes still have to filter out the negative voices that seek emotional responses from us. And so you don't have to be the badass all the time. You don't have to be the person who comes in with the great ideas or the best implementation or the most elegant code. It's very human to be the person with emotions and doubts and uncertainties, and it's completely normal and acceptable. I've heard from a lot of different people, whether it's from somebody who's a first-time contributor or somebody who's been at it for 5 to 10 plus years, that at times they still have feelings of doubt. I think it's more expected that when somebody is new that they have imposter syndrome, but it's been really eye-opening to have people like Guido respond to a question by saying, I don't know. If you don't have some sort of sense of uncertainty about the things that you're doing, you're probably not doing something that's really, truly challenging. Okay, so I love this image, and I think that everyone should hear this. I always want to remind people that the things that I know are not a subset of the things that everybody else knows. I don't know anything more than anyone else does. I just know different things. And so you may look up at the people who are on these stages today or who are key maintainers of a core library that you use and think that they're a rock star or a badass, but they aren't. We're all people who have suffered from imposter syndrome at points in our journey. Between 1500 to 1800, during the age of exploration, it's estimated that a disease called scurvy killed at least 2 million sailors. Symptoms include swollen, bleeding gums and loose teeth, bulging eyes, and swelling of the bones in one's arms and legs, before ultimately it caused death. A cure was discovered in 1535, when French explorers were treated by Native Americans with a special tea. Many captains at that time thought that a connection could be made between fruits and vegetables and the gruesome disease. A cure was also discovered again in 1734 by a Dutch physician, again tying it to fresh vegetables. The cure for scurvy has been infamously discovered and lost over and over throughout history. Knowledge that could have saved time and certainly could have saved lives. We know today that the simple cure for scurvy is none other than vitamin C. Anything that is not written down or taught to others is ultimately lost in time. I've had a chance to learn some of these bits and pieces of how Python got to where it is today, and I've learned enough to ensure that we don't hit some of the pitfalls that we've already encountered in our past. But the future of Python doesn't lie with me. We need to grow and bring on people who can keep Python going for years to come. But what if other people hit the same roadblocks as I did and don't have a mentor to encourage them? So recently there was a thread on the Python discourse where contributors shared their stories of early stage contributions. There were a couple of comments that stood out to me. So this says, my first impression with C Python development was not as positive as I had hoped. This one says, in the majority of cases, it's not so much what is said, but what isn't said. I don't think that many people could argue with the fact that figuring out how to contribute to C Python effectively is incredibly difficult. Sometimes there's a language barrier, whether written or code, Sometimes PRs sit for days, weeks, months without any sort of acknowledgement, leaving people feeling discouraged. Sometimes you just don't know what to work on. And so now that I've had some time to sort of distill my knowledge and reflect back, I have a better idea of what a Python core developer actually does and how you can use this to guide yourself to successfully contribute. It's given that core devs contribute code and must be trustworthy. It's also important that they can guide and participate in thoughtful discussions around their own code and others. Currently, the CPython repository has over 1,100 open pull requests. All of these must be reviewed and possibly merged in by a core developer. In doing so, there's support for new contributors to be given. In order to grow the team to have more people to work on whittling down that massive number of PRs that we have open, we need to see that somebody can navigate that with empathy. So my recommendations are to find modules that don't have experts listed, that need some extra TLC. Make an effort to meet a few core developers, whether on a mailing list, at a conference, or just reaching out to them directly. Just letting people know that you're there can help when your name then pops up on a pull request. Comment on old bugs and patches with suggestions, try to close out old issues, and really take ownership of something. There are a lot of ways that somebody contributes to a project. Contributing code is not the only thing that we need. There are lots of other roles that need to be filled. Open source is tricky, and it's kind of like starting your own business. You often start contributing because you want to write code, only to find out that there are actually a lot of other jobs and things that need to be done in order to keep the process moving. So if this is so hard and often thankless, then why do we do it? A lot of people come up to me and say, "Oh, you're a core developer, that's so cool." And it's like, well, sure, but there's also a lot of tedious work that goes on behind the scenes that a lot of people don't see, and sometimes it's not very glamorous. If you go into something expecting some sort of public recognition, you're probably not going to get very far. Personal drive and passion are going to be a lot more beneficial to the longevity of your efforts and motivation. I really encourage you to look at why you want to do any of the things that you're doing. If you find something that has that internal motivation, you'll continue working on that thing for years and years to come. And for me, at the end of the day, the fear of regret had to be greater than the fear of failure. You have to care deeply to put in the work, and you have to be willing to fail and to fail publicly, and still know that you have other people around you who will continue to support you. At the end of it, if I hadn't emailed Guido after all of those years, and if I hadn't just put myself out there and gotten past that fear, I never would have had the experience of getting to add a new operator to one of my favorite languages. And so our goal now has to be on how we can best support the future of Python. Today, there are around 100 core developers. Fewer than that are active, and far fewer than that are actually actively mentoring and fostering new contributors. But without new contributors, Python wouldn't get the love and support it deserves. And so this talk isn't really about me. It's for you. It's to demystify this process that I went through and kind of break down how none of the people that you see are really rock stars. It might look easy from the outside, or like things just happened overnight, and I can promise you that they don't. Python is a language that has greatly been led by a single person throughout its history, but it's really been shaped by all of us. We need to think about and intentionally shape our future, but we can't afford to lose our past, whether that means being aware of the languages that inspired Python to get where it is today, or the intimate knowledge of the code that still powers us decades later. I'm grateful to have had the chance to see people who are incredibly successful say that they don't know something, or were uncertain too. So my call to action to all of you is to be more open with each other. Say, I don't know, especially if you're somebody who's a more senior engineer in your company. By supporting each other through all of these highs and lows, making conscious choices, I know that we'll go further together. Thank you.
questions?
Good. Sure. So let's see. A lot of that is probably a little bit fuzzy even at this point. I think that I was lucky enough to have a really like well-defined PEP, and so I got to actually use like test-driven development. So I started off by actually writing a bunch of tests and understanding like what my constraints were and what I was working with. And so from there, some of it's pretty straightforward. You have to like add the new operator to the grammar and be able to parse that properly. And then the parts that got really tricky were like being able to control where the assignment operator was allowed to be used. And so being able to like constrain that, because with Python, the grammar is really simple, and so you can't do that at the grammar level. You have to actually do it as you're doing a run through of the code. And then the really fun part was like having to figure out how all of the like symbol table lookups were gonna work, because assignment expressions let you like declare a variable and then use it otherwise. And so the default sort of variable scoping was not going to work with how the PEP was set up. So, yeah.
Any other questions?
If you're feeling shy, you can also come up to me afterwards. Yeah, and I think that there's been a really big push and at least a little bit more awareness of these things, and so people are trying to support new contributors, be more aware. I think that there is a lot of really interesting discussion about the life cycle of Python and how like just even what our release cadence is and like what is included in Python and what can be an external library. And so I think that is one of the things that we all sort of need to take to heart, to think about what is Python and why do we have Python and how much do we want to put into the language itself to propel whatever future needs that Python will need to solve. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And just to say that, like, because we have these sort of arcane ways of doing things, does not necessarily mean that those things can't change. It just means that we have to be a little bit more careful about it. So, for example, we have some experiments going on of like switching out Python's parser and like really kind of like pulling out these older ways that we were doing things. But if Guido hadn't been involved in those conversations, we probably wouldn't have known the constraints that he was trying to keep by having a really, really simple like grammar. So.
All right, thank you, Emily. That was a very encouraging presentation.